It's just somebody who admitted I was sending a secret message to somebody through TV show being broadcast all over the country. Now, that's why I asked, if she could do that, why can't anybody else? If she was doing that, why do you think nobody else was doing the same thing?
Welcome to this episode of the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Sam Johnston. You know, it's so important to study certain figures in our history and to really understand who they were and what they brought to the table. Oftentimes, we just stop and focus and look at the good people in our culture, like the founding fathers or different presidents throughout the year or the ages or just different people that we really admire. But at the same time, it's also very, very important to know people on the other side of the aisle, the ones that have not been so good, the ones that have brought much despair to our culture, because we must understand why they've done what they do and how people today are using those exact same lessons to influence our culture currently. And almost no one has been more influential in our society than a guy named Aleister Crowley. He has dabbled in the dark arts and has been something that you may not know it, but has been a staple figure in our culture today. And to discuss that man and what he's done in our culture, we are joined by Ken Ami to talk about a couple different books that he's had, discussing Aleister Crowley, his effects on the culture, and then we're going to dive into what is it doing today and where do we see it that maybe you didn't know you even saw it. So, without further ado, Ken, how are you doing today?
Doing great, and I'm so appreciative that you're having me on to discuss this really important topic, because the hand guiding our culture is often behind the scenes, and this one certainly is.
Absolutely. Did I pronounce your last name right? I want to make sure I get it right.
You did. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
All right, perfect. All right, so, well, Ken, before we get started, can you give me some background on who you are, where you came from, and how you became an expert on these kind of topics?
Sure. Well, my background is very eclectic in a manner of speaking. I'm Jewish, and I came to accept Jesus as my Lord, God, and Savior and Messiah. So I have that part of my background. Of course, that took a really long time in my life. So along the way, I dipped my toe in a lot of areas, from the New Age movement to the reggae scene, and to dark music, dark movies. That's where, you know, Crowley came into play, is my interest in at least the subject of witchcraft and magic. Can't say I ever involved myself into that, but it was certainly something I started reading about in 6th grade. I would get myself down to the local library, and my main interests were the issues of UFOs and aliens, and cryptozoology, and witchcraft and magic and things like that. That's what I was interested in from that early age, and that really makes me realize now that I was on a trek for truth, and it was a very long and difficult, trying trek, and it definitely did get me to the truth eventually. And so one of the stories I tell in the book is that, as far as I remember, there are 2 excellent documentaries. One is called Hell's Bells, and one is called They Sold Their Souls for Rock and Roll. And in both of those, they talk about Aleister Crowley's influence in music. And they give examples of just how many lyrics either have the word-for-word quotations or allusions to his famous or infamous motto, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And when I saw that, it really blew me away, because I played music with 3 bands, and yet I ever wrote lyrics for one single song, and guess what the chorus was? "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." So That was well, that was the early '90s, so I was in my early 20s, and that really blew me away. I mean, it was literally unbelievable for me. I can't believe that I hit upon that just as so many others had. I mean, it was really kind of shocking, especially because at the time my interest in Crowley specifically was not great whatsoever. And I'm kind of thankful for that now. Pretty much I had attempted to make it through his book, Confessions. And fortunately, as I'm looking back on it, fortunately it was an extremely verbose and tedious book. It was essentially the near ramblings of an elderly, drug-addicted man who was on his way to the grave. And he's just kind of pontificating about everything under the sun. And I found it terribly disinteresting. So like I said, looking back on that, I'm glad that that's the first thing I try to make it through, because I was like, okay, I don't need to read any more from this particular guy. But still, somehow the influence was enough so that I ended up writing that chorus to the one single song I ever wrote lyrics for. I still can't understand exactly how that happened, but such were the things in which I was roughly interested at the time. And so way down the road, I mean, we're talking a long time later, are you aware of William Ramsey?
Yeah.
Yes. He's an attorney and a researcher, and I definitely consider him the premier modern-day Crowley scholar or researcher. And of course, he does it much as I do from the point of view of exposing Crowley and his influences. But I mean, when a guy like Ramsey literally travels to other countries to hold Crowley's handwritten text in his hand to research them for himself, I give him a lot of credit for that. And so Ramsey has done a lot of the background, what I consider reviewing the background information on Crowley, his biography and his worldview and all of that. So in fact, in the book, I mentioned straight up, go to Ramsey for all the background stuff. I can verify he knows what he's talking about, and he does a really good job of laying out the worldview and kind of what led Crowley to all the really strange places he ended up. And so, in fact, recently Ramsey published Children of the Beast, which is his book about a kind of a handful of extremely well-known, mostly older day musicians and directors that had influences on him. And I'm acquainted with Ramsey, so I told him I consider this book to be sort of a child to his book. Here, which is mine, we have both talked about how my book is basically like a modern day version of his, even though his is brand new as well. But mine is more like up to date. So what are people doing today? The stars that are hot right now, not the Doors and Kenneth Anger and these older time people that Ramsey covered, who are extremely influential in their own way, of course. I mean, you might not think about it initially, but I mean, when the Doors are singing "Cancel My Subscription to the Resurrection," they're talking about how he has a reservation in the house of detention. I got a friend inside. It's it's very beyond their pop songs, which are just what they are. They did get into a lot of deep philosophical and theological issues, things that you don't really think about when you're just listening to it because you enjoy the music and you're not really interested in the lyrical content. These guys, as many have come to realize, these musicians realized that they are performing what I will call ritual. They're basically spreading their own pseudo-gospel through their music. That's exactly what they were doing. The Doors, opening the doors of perception. I mean, it was all about deconstructing theology and opening the doors to cultural change. And some of them were extremely well aware that that's what they were doing. And so through all of that, you see Crowley, not surprisingly, because he was himself very flamboyant, very good at what we would call PR, very good at making bombastic statements that would get him a lot of attention, and doing outrageous things that would get him a lot of attention, sometimes unwanted attention, but nevertheless, very much like Anton LaVey, who went on to found the Church of Satan in the mid-60s. He too, he was very good at PR. His appearance, just looking at him, you would know, okay, this guy's up to something. And he portraying something by his appearance. He knew kind of buttons to push. So both of these men definitely knew how to influence culture. And whether for good or bad, or whether people ended up loving them or hating them, it's really free advertisement is the way we would look at it, right? Like Oscar Wilde wrote in the portrait of Dorian Gray, he writes, "The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about." Okay, and unfortunately we have an entire culture now that is looking for their 15 minutes of fame, which can be easily had by a lot of people just by a wacky YouTube video. So they don't care if the attention is good or bad, if people are haters or lovers. It's just as long as their name gets out there. And Crowley was definitely very good at doing that kind of thing, even in the low-tech manner he had to do it, which was basically getting newspapers to call him the wickedest man in the world and things like that. I mean, he really thrived off that, you know.
Yeah, that's a really good intro to who he was as a person, and yeah, you definitely see that in our culture, trying to get that 15 minutes of fame and just getting your name out there, or an hour-long podcast about really interesting topics that everyone should love. But I guess only cool people do that. Anyway, that being said, so who was Aleister Crowley? Where did he come from? Like, what's his background, and how did he become the father of all of this derailing of our culture, in a sense?
Well, so Crowley was born in 1875. That's, you know, quite some time ago. He died in 1947. So the fact that we're talking about him today, not just as, you know, I subtitled my book, How an Obscure Occultist Influences Culture from Beyond the Grave. And I mean, obviously, he would have been absolutely nothing but an obscure occultist had he not managed to tap into a lot of lines of influences, you know, from, like I said, pageantry and theatrics, for example. Because if you look at magical rituals, they are pageantry. They are like putting on a show. You got the robes, you got the motions, and that goes directly into what's going on in music, for instance. When you see pretty well known by now, I guess in certain circles, examples of people like Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin or David Bowie literally performing actions on stage, which you can trace back to the Ordo Templi Orientis, some of their poses. I mean, they're literally on stage performing magical acts. And, of course, most people wouldn't even realize it. And if they did, they would just say it's all part of the show and you know, just shrug it off that way. But, I mean, that is what's happening. And so there's also, theologically, it is within man's nature to rebel against God, right? So let me give you an example of something Crowley stated, which is part of the reason he's so influential in fallen culture as well as fallen artistry, and I'll get back to that in a second. So this was supposedly channeled by Crowley, but it states, "I am the snake that giveth knowledge and delight and bright glory and stirs the heart of man with drunkenness. To worship me, take wine and strange drugs, whereof I will tell my prophet, and be drunk thereof." So, I mean, that's almost like the 60s in one sentence.
Yeah, no kidding. And that's before he, to be way before the 60s and today, yes, even. So that's interesting.
So one thing I note in the book is that inevitably, if you listen to an interview by a modern day quote unquote artist, okay, and I'm talking about a musician or director or whatever it happens to be, even comedians, inevitably when they're asked about their art, they will speak in terms of that it's all about deconstruction, right? It's all about busting taboos, breaking down morals, you know, down your throat, in your face. It's all about destruction, in other words. And I always lament that the interviewers never say, well, is that written in stone somewhere? I mean, where did you get this idea that art, thus what you are doing, is supposed to be all about deconstruction? Right? I mean, that's a worldview right there. Where did you get this idea? Because the fact is that true artists, and I'm talking about the old-time poets, musicians, painters, whose works we've known for centuries. They're centuries old and we still know them. Mostly they would tell us that they were doing their art to glorify God. Okay, and so you see a huge difference philosophically right then and there, that the true great works of art that have survived centuries were to glorify God or in some way accurately reflect His creation. Whereas modern day, influenced by the likes of Crowley and such, it's all about destruction and construction and breaking down and tearing down. So that alone, I think, speaks a lot. Because if you remember reading Francis Schaeffer's book, where he touches upon worldview quite heavily, and he has a section on art, and it really opened my eyes because he's talking about how, you know, you look at a Picasso, and I mean, obviously it's very abstract. You look at a Salvador Dali, and it's very surreal. And what he's saying is that those are reflections of worldviews, so that they're deconstructing reality. And reality is God created reality. So what they're doing by their art is deconstructing it. So now it's surreal and abstract, and there's no, as Nietzsche would say, there's no up and down anymore. There's just basically do what thou wilt. We're right back to that.
And again, you talk about destruction, which is interesting because what does God do, and what does God call us to do? God calls us to create things and be you know, create all these wonderful pieces of art. And what does Satan do? He instructs people to destroy because he can't create. So
Yes.
Again, I've heard people say, well, Aleister Crowley, he wasn't a Satanist, or he wasn't a bad guy. I've researched on him, and what do you say to people like that who come up to you and say, well, Aleister Crowley really wasn't a bad guy?
Well, I would question their definition of good and bad to begin with. Because obviously that is a big topic. If you are basing your statement on an as of yet unstated definition of good or bad, well, we need to talk about that first. In your worldview, what is good or bad? Why is it that way? And who says, basically? So basically, I mean, if you read Crowley's statements, all you could do to say that he was a good guy is to say, well, he was just being emotive, or I should say hyperbolic. He was just exaggerating and making statements just to be shocking. And, well, you can't blame me because that's the kind of stuff he wrote. So just because you don't want to take him seriously when he's saying things like to sacrifice a young boy, and I'd take him seriously, you can't blame me for that because he's the one saying it.
So let's dive into some specifics. Where do we see him today? I mean, the things that come to my mind is people like Charlie Manson just died, and you can hear, like, one of the things that he said was he heard like the Beatles speaking to him, and even in your book you talk about the Beatles and how they got influenced by Crowley's teaching as well. So you can see that chain of his teaching affecting real people and making them do all sorts of crazy things. So kind of what are some other specific examples?
Now, I would think it would be fair to say, okay, look, you can't really take
Charles Manson seriously because the guy's nuts. Well, yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, he obviously had his problems. On another level, he pretty much spent decades in prison for being influential. I mean, he never really committed any acts on his own. He was literally locked up because he was seen as a menace. And so, were the Beatles trying to communicate with him through songs? I highly doubt it. Were there hidden meanings in songs? Of course there are, but to what degree are they tailor-made for you and me? One thing I would like to talk about is the issue of backmasking, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? It's and I would say that there's two kinds of things that people mean by backmasking, and I'm bringing it up because we're talking about musicians now. So one is when, I mean, I know I've done it back in the day when you were literally spinning a record. You could put your finger on it, run it backwards. And so one thing people mean by backmasking is that you could run the whole song backwards and you're claiming to hear this or that secret message that played backwards says who knows what, just something. And that, I don't know, I don't really go along with that very much because it seems really subjective, and it's no surprise that every time someone's trying to show that to you on a video, they have to use the subtitles. I mean, they have to use the, in other words, they type it out on the screen because it's so unobvious what is being said that they have to tell you, here's what I'm hearing. But there are obvious cases of backmasking, which is when you'll hear a song and there's an obvious voice saying something and it's obviously backwards. That's very different. For example, I remember Iron Maiden's album Peace of Mind, and this is between songs, so it's not like mixed in with a bunch of noise, so you have to force yourself to think you heard something. It's literally very obvious that it's someone speaking backwards. And so I remember putting my finger on that when I was a teenager, running the record backwards, and there was definitely a hidden message in there that you wouldn't, I guess you'd have to use technological means today, whereas back then all you had to do is use your finger. And what they were saying backwards was, don't mess with things you don't understand. So I don't know if they were being playful or what, but I thought that was kind of cute that they knew some teenager like me was going to be out there doing this, and they're just saying, hey, don't mess with this stuff if you don't understand it, whatever that might mean.
That's pretty crazy.
And so one thing, I spoke to William Ramsey about it. He said, wow, I was just not aware. I don't know how you found all these modern day musicians who are into Crowley. And I said, well, you know, technology has changed such that by use of the internet, that was really easy research because no, I'm not enough of an expert in every kind of musical genre that I could have somehow managed to pull these lyrics. But nowadays, you just go into a website that has song lyrics and you can type things in like Crowley or Do What Thou Wilt or Everyone's a Star, things like that. And so that was very easy. That part of it was easy research because it was literally just searching online. And then there's more subtle stuff, such as people who are apparently emulating some of Crowley's poses, such as he has a very famous one where he has his hands in fists at either side of his head with the thumbs pointed upwards. Some people call it a thumbs up, and apparently he's emulating horns. And so you see people doing that, or there's a pose of Crowley where it looks like he's taking the pose that is taken by Adam in the painting from the Sistine Chapel, The Creation of Adam. Adam is in a certain pose. You see Crowley doing that one, and I had noticed that Damien Eccles was doing that one as well. If you recognize that name, Damien Eccles is one of the twice convicted murderers involved in the West Memphis 3 case. And he is very, very, very open about how much Crowley has influenced him and how much he's continuing on his own magical practices, speaking of Eccles. So I definitely noticed the correlation between them. And so this concept of everyone's a star, obviously, that's a Crowley phrase, and it's just literally all over our culture. I mean, we refer to celebrities as stars. What is that? That's very straightforward right there.
You brought up his motto, which I find interesting. Is can you expand on? There's a second half of that motto that people like to apply, and some people like to apply it to say, oh, see, again, he's talking about love, and it's not about this evil mentality. So yeah, can you talk about what is his full motto and what does it actually mean?
You know what, Samuel? I know what you're talking about. I've personally still trying to wrap my mind around that because I don't want to uncontextualize what he was saying. And I know a lot of people have said, well, I know what he was talking about and he meant this. But when he says love under will, I've still been attempting to define that in his own terms, and I've not quite been able to penetrate that. So I wouldn't want to make too much of a comment on that. But the line is love is the law, love under will. But the thing is, when you read the context around which that statement was made, I mean, he's talking about I'm the hog-headed God pecking out the eyes of Jesus. I mean, he badmouths Islamic prophet Muhammad, which is kind of rare that anybody would badmouth anybody but Jesus. So I'll give him credit for that at least, that he was kind of a equal opportunity besmircher when it comes to that. But I mean, obviously, yeah, if you do read the context in which that statement was made, he's not talking about flower power. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, so let's fast forward to today. You said that your book was more of a modern version. So what stars do we see, more today that are influenced by his teachings? And I guess even more specifically, what ideas do they promote in their teachings that are Crowley based? I guess that would be the main questions. What ideas are they pushing that are Crowley based?
Yeah, I would say that the main concept behind ritual magic is to have energy driving your intentions. And so you have an intention of something you want to take place, and you do something that generates what they would call energy, and that is supposed to be the driving force behind what makes your desires happen. Right? Literally an exercise of your own will. And so this is how you can see that concert performances can be employed as a massive engine to produce energy. I know a Christian musician who said, we used to urge our crowds to yell out, "Grease the duck." Okay? And they, "Grease the duck, yeah, grease the whole crowd in the auditorium would be chanting that. And then they would say, "Why are you guys yelling that? Why? It's meaningless." You're sitting there getting all excited and yelling that just because a couple musicians on stage told you to say that? Why? And they would just turn it into a teaching moment about, why are you just going along with the crowd and listening to us just because we're the ones on stage? And I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah.
But I mean, when you think about that, so obviously the amount of energy produced by a concert and from people acting together is enormous. And they view this as the power behind having their own will come about. For instance, Steve Tyler from Aerosmith has stated that he has used the Crowleyan and OTO, the Order Templi Orientis, their concepts of sex magic. And it's the same exact thing. It's you have a certain intention in mind, and when it comes to the the moment of release, they believe that's what powers your intention to literally have your will bend reality. I can also think of, I don't want to get too explicit, but Grant Morrison is a very well-known comic book artist. And one of his comic books wasn't doing very well, so he called on his fans to get behind him, in a manner of speaking. Okay, look, he basically told his fans, you should masturbate with the intention that my comic book would sell well, and apparently tons of his fans were more than pleased to oblige. And the thing about Grant Morrison, let me take one step back. There's a Rice University professor named Jeffrey Kripal. He wrote a very, very, very interesting book called Mutants and Mystics, where he talks about the backgrounds of a lot of the early comic book artists and sci-fi story writers. And inevitably, all those guys were either into the occult, into drug use, or they had mental problems, or any combination thereof. Okay, and Professor Jeffrey Kripal is possessed. Now, when I say he's possessed, those are not my words. I'm quoting his own self-description of himself. Okay, he's the one that says he says he went to India and he got possessed by Kali, one of the Hindu goddesses. And so he views what he's doing now through his teaching as a professor as doing her will. Well, the story that Kripal tells about Grant Morrison, the comic book artist, is almost exactly the same. Grant Morrison went to India for certain tantric festivals, tantra being basically a Hindu form of sex magic, and he got possessed. And so now Morrison is out there doing his thing at the beck and call of whatever is possessing him. And now, have you heard of Comic-Con?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Comic-Con, what kind of like a family-friendly fun time is that? You get dressed up as your favorite superheroes and you go look at comic books and whatever. Well, at Comic-Cons, you can also run into lectures by Grant Morrison telling you to practice Crowleyan magic, straight up.
Huh.
You think your kids are just going there to look at their latest comic book, and they're listening to this guy encouraging them to practice Crowleyan magic. I mean, it's unbelievable, this stuff.
That group mentality of getting everyone together and feeding off their energy is, well, one, it's like biblical but twisted, because God talks about the power of unity that we have as Christians. And then also it makes me wonder about the quantum field theory and how that kind of applies to this, and if they're feeding off the fields. That's a way different topic, but it's just kind of something that was in my mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it the way you just did, because it's been pretty obvious throughout the millennia that people have recognized everything Satan does is a copy but corrupt version of everything God does. So in other words, Satan considers what God has done, and he does the same thing, but inside out, upside down, and backwards, right, in a corrupted manner. So in a way, it's appealing to us because it is seemingly like a godly thing, but then it's appealing to us because we're fallen, and so we love the corruption of it all. And that's why you end up with these stories, such as in Gnosticism, about how one of the many gods was senile, obviously, because he created a material realm which is corrupt, and he's arrogant enough to claim to his creation that he's the one and only God, and he has them corralled in this nice little garden, and so there comes the one true savior, Satan, the serpent, the devil, and literally liberates humanity and gives them enlightenment, gives them freedom, gives them wisdom. That's how you end up with these completely corrupted versions of the Bible text.
And that's what our culture's heading to. You know, what is good is gonna be said as evil, and what's evil is gonna be as good. And so you just see that flip coming. That's always the goal, is to flip the culture the other way. And kind of going back to that feeding off that energy, we just had that liberal scream on November 8th. If you were upset that Trump got elected and everyone got together in parks and just screamed at the sky hopelessly. It's such a stupid thing, but if you kind of think about it in the light that we're talking about, it's very interesting how that can be used to feed off that energy, to, if you believe that Donald Trump is a good guy, to feed off that energy and try to take him down a step further. And I guess I'm still kind of out on whether he's real or not, but that's not the point. The point is just like that, getting together and feeding off that energy. So yeah, I think that mentality needs to be brought up a little bit more. And then, so here, do you think that idea of group cohesiveness or using energy of a group can be applied to thing when like a celebrity dies and everyone's like thinking about death and they're focusing their energy on that celebrity's death? Do you think that same mentality can be used to take that energy from the society and apply it to evil things?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because back in the 60s, there was such a thing as primal scream therapy, where people literally just yell at the top of their lungs, and it was supposed to be cathartic. Just releasing all that energy, getting it all out of you, and that was the end thing for quite a while. I mean, as far as the mechanics of it, don't ask me, but basically I would categorize it as maybe part of what people mean in terms of spiritual warfare when they talk about how it has a litigious aspect of it. It's sort of like an opening of a door, right? You open the door to influence in your life and your mind. I would view it sort of like that thing. That's what you're putting out there, is that you are that open to it, that you're basically putting a neon sign on top of your head that says, "Come in, we're open." And and all that energy is just lighting up that neon sign. In fact, let me tell you a somewhat related story. So going back to when I was a teenager, or maybe my early 20s, I remember seeing Pink Floyd in concert. And between songs, they started talking about how it was an outdoor auditorium, and it was basically in the shape of a bowl, if you can picture that, right? There's the flat ground, and there's the bowl. You'd take a few steps down, and there were the seats. And they're talking about how, wow, we're all together here in this bowl-like structure. Let's send out a message and energy out into the universe. And they were talking about it in terms of if there's other intelligent life out there. But that was precisely what they were encouraging us all to do, is basically they were viewing the auditorium or the amphitheater as a satellite dish.
Mm-hmm.
Same kind of shape, right? A bowl type shape.
Right.
And they were saying, let's just send out all this energy out into the universe. It's the same exact thing. So whether they were talking about it so you could contact ET or or your spirit guide or angels or demons or spirits, however, it's the same kind of a concept. Is basically, that's why I said it's like you're putting a huge neon sign out there, and the more energy you put into it, the brighter it glows, and the more these beings can see it.
Well, I guess the next step that I would go to is, what about sporting events? Do you have an opinion on sporting events? You get a large group of people together, the energy is all focused on your team winning. Do you think that in itself has occultic, Crowley ties to it?
Just last night I was talking to one of my sons about how maybe when someone was a child, they had a poster of superheroes in their room. And now that they're a grown-up, they have a poster of a sports figure in their room. And it's the same kind of thing, basically. I mean, it's a superhero. It's just Now they're not a mutant or an alien. Now they're really good at bouncing a ball on the ground or something really impressive like playing catch when you're a grown man for millions of dollars. So, no, absolutely. I, I mean, when you think about how many people attend any given local church and how many people will absolutely jam pack an entire stadium and yell at the top of their lungs for hours and hours and hours because grown men are playing catch or grown men are hitting a ball with a stick, or kicking a ball. I mean, it's really astonishing how much people can get into it to the point where, I mean, they're memorizing statistics and they can tell you every player every year and the scores and all this stuff. But yeah, that is huge. I mean, just think about doing the wave, right, in a stadium. I mean, how much more literal can you get than full group participation? You are literally part of that gigantic crowd where otherwise you would just be an insignificant nobody in the face of so many thousands of people.
Right.
But now you're watching that energy wave, literally watching that energy wave going across the entire crowd. I mean, I could definitely understand that would feel great and that would be exciting, especially if you're the guy who started it. So I wouldn't want to use the term social animals because I don't believe human beings are animals, but we are definitely social creatures since we humans have been created in the image of a God who is triune. And so by nature and essence, God is a relational being because of the relationships occurring within the Godhead, which have been eternal. So that way, I can understand why, I definitely can understand why people would look positively in joining together in crowds and doing things in groups. Now, whether that's enjoying a sporting event or engaging in a riot, I mean, either way, it's easy to move a crowd along that way because people want that. People want that sense of fellowship. And so we're back to the issue of the energy again, the energy of a crowd. In fact, I remember earlier this year there was a fire alarm that went off in my building at work, and so of course everybody steps out. And there were maybe 1/4 of the people in the building to my right and 3/4 to my left. And all of a sudden, the 1/4 on my right started walking back to the building, and the 3/4 didn't. And I thought, what am I, in a Milgram experiment? I mean, it was weird. It was like, what am I going to do? And so it was part of that appeal to, am I going to go with this crowd or am I going to go with this crowd? Which one? The ones on my right or the ones on my left? And it was, I caught myself in that moment of, am I going to start heading back to the building because these guys are, or not because these guys aren't? It was kind of interesting. So we're all back to influence.
Well, which way did you go?
Since the ones on my right were heading into the back door, I went that way.
Cool. Okay. Can't leave me on a cliffhanger like that. No, but getting back to the sporting event that's really interesting because sporting events is, I guess, what kind of energy are you emitting when you're at a sporting event? A lot of people, it's very division based, right? You're rooting for your team versus someone else. And so if you, I don't know, I love sports. Sports is like, I grew up on sports. I coach hockey. I love being a part of, feeling like a part of that community of a bigger team. And it's done a lot of good for me. But ultimately, if you're going into it with emitting energy of negativity and hatefulness, then you're playing into a much larger role of this occult nature of getting people's energy to do hateful and divisive things. So you have to really watch yourself when you get involved with those type of things. And I guess the next natural step would be to head over to things like the Super Bowl and the halftime show. I mean, what's your opinions on that? I mean, just it falls so much in line of what we're talking about tonight.
Right. That is, in fact, now that you mention it, I have a quotation I thought I had a quotation in the book from Madonna who called it the Holy Grail. As far as, she would say, well, she's a Kabbalist too, or at least she was. So basically they're viewing that as the holy grail of all performances. And of course, the way that many of them perform it, it's obviously a form of a ritual. I mean, it's going beyond um, I'm playing music so you could enjoy it, and maybe I'll get some album sales out of this. No, it's obviously going much further when they're reenacting um, rituals that many people who understand magic or Freemasonry or something can see exactly that they are performing some sort of ritual, sometimes taking very obvious poses or using sigils, um, certain geometric like patterns on the stage and all these things, making hand symbols. It's and I would think that I would say there's a fine line here, because a cottage industry has arisen around attempting to discern symbolism in movies and videos and music and concerts and all that. And obviously it's easy to go way too far where somebody can't make an OK sign without somebody claiming that they're secretly telling you 666. I mean, you have to keep a level head about it, but that there's something obviously there. I always say that if Carol Burnett could pull on her ear to signify to her grandmother that she was saying hi to her at the broadcast of her TV show, how come she can do it and nobody else does? I mean, why would nobody else be doing anything like that? Of course they are. And like I said, you can't instantly jump to the conclusion that, look at the way he scratched his nose. That was
Yeah.
obviously. But there are some very obvious things going on. And for instance, in the book, one of the examples that I gave, which is not necessarily Crowley, oh no, it is. Sorry, what I was going to say is one of the things I point out is the symbol that Jay-Z is very famous for doing, which is he'll hold his hands up above his head, and he'll make the sign of a triangle, right?
Mm-hmm.
You seen this?
Yeah.
Yeah, and people say, oh, that's an Illuminati pyramid. Okay, now I'm not even quite sure what that means. I know what they're trying to say by it, but to my taste, that's just a little generic to say an Illuminati pyramid. It does, it doesn't really mean much in real life on the ground, except I know what they're saying is that he's making a certain symbol and it has meaning. Yes, I agree with that. So what I noticed is that it looks exactly like a pose that is specified within OTO rituals. I mean, it's not like you have to take that photograph and put it upside down and turn the color up or something. It's just a straight up OTO pose. That's all there is to it. That's one thing I outline in the book in quite a bit of detail. And I show how H.R. Giger, the artist who is very famous for his work on the Alien movie series, he had a painting called Emblem for a Secret Society. And it's precisely that. It's those hands in that shape. I mean, that's what it is. Then I show a photograph in the book of H.R. Giger in one of his studies, and who is on the wall hanging behind him in a painting. It's Aleister Crowley. And then I have a few other photographs in there, including Anton LaVey making the same kind of pyramid hand symbol, and other magicians doing the same thing. So that's when I was trying to get a little more specific. Instead of saying, oh, look, it's an Illuminati pyramid, it's saying, well, what is he actually doing? Now, can I claim that I happen to know for a fact that Jay-Z is purposefully trying to emulate an OTO ritual pose? No, I can't say that. I can just only show you that it looks exactly the same.
Yeah. It's definitely a slippery slope when you kind of dive into the symbols of our world, and even to the well-educated people on symbols. You can look at things like what's on my shirt. I mean, this logo is very intentionally done, and I guess, what does that mean to you? Like, should I be wearing this shirt? I don't know. It's such a dangerous, slippery slope that you have to be able to, discern what is okay for us as Christians to dive into. And so I guess that's where I want to end it today. So let me ask you one last question. As Christians, how do we fight against this Crowley occult nature that's creeping up all over our society?
Well, you say last questions, but you just gave me a lot of food for thought at the end there. So if you don't mind, I'm going to make a statement after I answer your question.
Okay.
So one thing is, I would tell people, don't freak out. I mean, obviously, this isn't about fear-mongering. This is just about awareness. And to me, the reason I mentioned Carol Burnett is because that's a very simple, down-to-earth, easy-to-understand point, which is that she would tug on her ear during the broadcast of her show. And nobody would have known what that was about or that it meant anything, and maybe nobody would have even noticed unless she had done what she did, which is to state, the reason I was doing that is to signify to my grandmother who watched the show that I was saying hi to her, right? That's just very basic, accessible. It's not difficult. It's just somebody who admitted I was sending a secret message to somebody through TV show being broadcast all over the country. Now, that's why I asked, if she can do that, why can't anybody else? If she was doing that, why do you think nobody else is doing the same thing? So that's just a very basic idea. Now, who is doing it and why? That's a different issue. So, for example, if you go watch a movie, someone walks into their house. Every single item in that house was placed there on purpose by a set designer. Does that mean every single thing in that house has a secret hidden meaning? No. But it is a fact that somebody had to design the set. And there are those times where it's quite obvious that something is being placed there on purpose. Such as, who knows, maybe they do a close-up of a bookshelf where it's obvious they're wanting you to notice some of the titles of the books. Or in the series Breaking Bad, I noticed tons of symbolism in there. And that symbolism that was being repeated throughout the episodes, so that it wasn't, I saw one thing one time, gotcha. No, it was like, okay, why does this keep happening? And then when you get into the issue of why, that's probably, or who and why is probably the most difficult thing. Because we don't really know. I mean, that we can see certain symbolism would be a fairly easy case, but to prove something like that, I don't see how we could do it. I mean, who was it? The script writer, the director, the set designer, the actor? Who was it? Well, I don't know. I wasn't there. So those are very different issues. And of course, why they're doing it is another issue altogether. It could be maybe just to get attention, because I know with the cottage industry that has arisen around this stuff, hey, if somebody asked my advice about making a movie, I'd say, hey, put a bunch of these symbols in there, and you'll get a bunch of people bringing attention to your movie because they're saying, oh, look at all this stuff I found in there. Yeah. So that's why throughout the book, one thing I should mention is I do provide a lot of images just to show these things. For example, I'm looking at one right now from one of the Hellraiser movies, and the doctor goes to look out the window of his apartment or his house, and there's a photograph of Aleister Crowley on the wall. Okay, so that to me is a very obvious, purposeful thing. Now, again, is it because in the movie the guy's being portrayed as an evil guy and he had evil influences, or is it because the director or screenwriter is trying to get us to be interested in Crowley? I don't know. All I can do is tell you, hey, look what I noticed here. That's yeah. So what you raised about symbolism, such as on your jacket, again, I go from encouraging level-headedness to discernment, because the fact is there are three basic shapes. There's the circle, triangle, and square. So if you're a graphic artist and you're hired to create a logo for a company, inevitably you are going to either use one or more of those shapes or some abstract of one or more of those shapes. That's why you can't go crazy and say, a triangle. That means the Illuminati is behind it. Well, maybe it's just a triangle. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar.
Yeah.
I think that you would need a context around that by which to read the conclusion that, okay, no, this is sinister. You would need to know something else, something. And so, for instance, going back to my friend William Ramsey, he just released a documentary about what's called the smiley face killers. And he talks about how, from a statement made by Aleister Crowley, which is about how the universe is really just one big joke, we ended up with a happy face or a smiley face, which is often just a happy face or a smiley face, but you also find it in tons of contexts that are less than happy, and there's no reason to smile, such as in the Watchmen comic books and movie series, where the comedian wears it as a pin on his lapel. Well, he's basically a psychopath. It's not happy, it's not smiley, and the pin ends up with blood, his own blood on it. And so there's tons of examples of a friendly, smiling little face that's used to mean something sinister. And then that's pretty obvious. And what I wanted to do really quick, it'll just take me a minute or two, is to give you some examples of how sometimes I will do symbolism busting right out of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So, for instance, there's the famous symbol of the hidden hand, most famously known from Napoleon Bonaparte. But you can find pictures of Friedrich Nietzsche and tons of people doing it, where they're sticking their hand inside the front of their coat, right? That's called the sign of the hidden hand. And I noticed that in Exodus, when God is telling Moses to go before Pharaoh, that scene basically takes place. God says, put your hand into your robe, bring it back out, and his hand comes out leprous. And then he says, put your hand back in your robe, bring it back out, and it's healed. And so the sign of the hidden hand is just that there's a hidden hand moving events behind the seeming front person. And so in that case, you see where they got that from, because Moses is the front man acting on behalf of the hidden hand, who is God, right? Then another one that's become extremely famous nowadays due to the homosexual movement is the rainbow, which also has a long history of being used in the occult as well. And obviously, I mean, in the Bible, the rainbow is a very positive symbol of God's promise to never again destroy the earth by flooding. So it's almost like they're taking advantage of this promise of God to not destroy, at least not in that way.
Yeah.
To kind of put an arc of protection around themselves, but be that as it may. And then also there's what's called the goat of Mendes. So if you can picture the cover of the Satanic Bible, for instance, you have the very famous upside down pentacle with a goat's head inside of it, right? And that's called the goat of Mendes. And that ends up as the Baphomet, the hermaphroditic goat guy, whatever that's supposed to be. And that comes out of the ritual where a goat would have the placed upon it, and then it would be released out into the wilderness, right? So you have this scapegoat, literal scapegoat, carries away the sins. And so, when you think about it, there is a lot of symbolism that they seem to have derived from the Bible. Oh, for example, another famous occult symbol is a lightning strike. You find it, for instance, on the forehead of Harry Potter Or last night I happened to flip channels and it was on the forehead of RoboCop when he sustained a certain kind of damage. And then sometimes you see it combined with a tree, like in Jerry Buckheimer's logo for his production company. It's a lightning striking a tree. And so the lightning strike, obviously Jesus saying, I saw Satan fall to earth fall from heaven as lightning. I think that's why that's become such a popular symbol in occultism. It's because it identifies Satan. And striking a tree, obviously, it's either striking at the tree of life or just showing the way to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Lightning, basically lighting things up, which comes to be symbolic of enlightenment, which is what they view Satan as bringing enlightenment. And then you end up with the concepts of like the Promethean torch, because in Greek mythology, Prometheus is basically a Satan-type character who rebels against Zeus and gives fire to humanity against his will. So again, fire, light, enlightenment. It's symbolic again. I just thought you'd find that interesting, how a lot of the symbols that are used, abused, and misused in occultism seem to actually come right out of the Bible, where they had other meanings.
Yeah, it just turning that good into evil and the evil into good. You see it all over the place, and you definitely give us a lot of food for thought. And unfortunately, I do have to cut the interview short here just to stay on time, but we could go on, and we'll have you back for sure to go into many other books. You've written books all over the place on so many different topics. Where's the best people to find? Where can people find you? Where can they buy your books, and how can they support you?
I try to keep it really simple. If you just go to my website, you'll find everything that you could ever want to know about me, and all my social networking sites and books and all that stuff. And it's one word, truefreethinker.com. So that way, if you go there, you'll find absolutely everything you could ever not care to know about me.
All right, everyone, definitely go head over there and buy his books, and just to do some more research on what makes our world the way it is, and what important factors played in history to get us to where we are now, and still playing an important role is so important. And most importantly, just being aware of what is actually reality will give you so much power over that darkness to change your reality, and to refocus your energy on God. It says glorify God all the time, nonstop. Well, that's just focusing your energy on God and bringing goodness and creating things into the world that wouldn't have been there before. And so it's this battle of energy back and forth, and that's what we're part of. So it's important to know what your energy is being used for and how you're focusing it. So thank you, Ken, so much for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Samuel, it's been a pleasure, and I just feel like we barely scratched the subject because it's such a huge topic, but it's been definitely a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, it's been fun. It was such a smooth transition. We kind of had a plan on where we were going to go, and then we're talking about the Super Bowl and sports all of a sudden. So that's how it goes, and that's perfectly okay. Just let the Holy Spirit lead us. Right. Guys, if you liked what you heard, definitely leave a comment below and talk about what some different ideas that were put forth. And if you want to hear more, say, hey, I want to hear more about this, and we'll get Ken back for sure. I'm not going to ask you to like, subscribe, or share, but hey, I appreciate it if you do. Remember to check out my website, sharpeningreport.com, for all sorts of different wonderful things. And that's what we got for you guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great week. Yeah, definitely. Interesting. That's weird. All right. Well, hey, yeah, I definitely appreciate you coming on the show. It was great. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah, you too. Sorry about the slow start, but I'm really glad that we've connected.
Me too. All right, Ken, you have a good night.
Hey, God bless, brother.